Good afternoon, friends, and a very warm welcome to this special briefing on Prime Minister's visit to Indonesia and Singapore. This will not be followed by my weekly briefing, and the simple reason is that we have the annual press conference by our External Affairs Minister on Monday. So after the opening remarks by Secretary East, Preeti Saran, I also have Joint Secretary South, Manish. After opening remarks by the Secretary, we will have some time for questions and answers. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ravish. Good afternoon, dear friends, and very warm welcome to the Ministry of External Affairs this afternoon for this special briefing for our Prime Minister's visit to Indonesia and to Singapore, which will be from 29th of May to 2nd of June. During this visit, our Prime Minister will also deliver the keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore on 1st of June. This is our Prime Minister's first official visit to Indonesia and his second official visit to Singapore. You would recall that in 2015, our Prime Minister had gone in March for the funeral of Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, and then in November made his first official visit. For those of you who have been following developments of our bilateral relations with the Southeast Asian countries would have noticed that in the last 4 years, we have had visits to all the 10 ASEAN countries at the highest level, that is at the level of our President, our Vice President, and our Prime Minister, who have covered all the 10 ASEAN countries. Our Prime Minister's visit takes place to Indonesia and to Singapore in this context of continued engagement with a very important part of the region with whom we attach a lot of importance, which symbolizes our commitment to deepening relations with ASEAN states in particular and with the Indo-Pacific region in general within the framework of our Act East policy that was articulated by Prime Minister 4 years back at the India-ASEAN Summit in Naypyidaw in 2014. This visit also takes place in a landmark year in the context of India-ASEAN relations. You would recall that we were very proud to have hosted all the 10 leaders for the ASEAN-India Commemorative Summit in January this year, when we celebrated 25 years of our dialogue partnership, 15 years of our summit partnership, and 5 years of our strategic partnership with ASEAN. You know that Indonesia hosts the ASEAN Secretariat, and Singapore presently is the current chair of ASEAN. Next year, we will celebrate 70 years of India-Indonesia diplomatic relations. I'll move on to country-specific details. As far as Indonesia is concerned, I already mentioned that it's his first visit by our Prime Minister at the invitation of the President of Indonesia, President Joko Widodo, who, as you would recall, had visited India on a state visit in December 2016. And of course, he was here again in January this year for the ASEAN-India Commemorative Summit. Our Prime Minister and President Jokowi had first met officially in Naypyidaw in 2014. And of course, they have been meeting on the margins of, interacting on the margins of the ASEAN-related summits each year since then, and at the G20 and other forums as well. With Indonesia, we share very deep historical civilizational linkages. We share common values of democracy, of pluralism, and of course respect for rule of law. India and Indonesia have had millennia-old contacts. Indonesians themselves acknowledge that Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam all traveled to Indonesia from India. Our respective struggles for freedom from colonial rule was also marked by close friendship and collaboration at the level of our leaders, both fighting for independence of our respective countries. President Sukarno was the first foreign head of state to have visited India as the chief guest for our Republic Day. And so we've had actually 3 leaders from Indonesia as chief guests to our Republic Day, most recently, of course, being President Jokowi himself. We are, of course, very strong maritime neighbors and strategic partners. Since 2005, we have had a strategic partnership with Indonesia, and it plays a very vital role. The country plays a vital role in advancing India's Act East policy and in deepening our relations with ASEAN, being the largest economy and the largest country in the ASEAN. We are, in fact, natural partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Indonesia is our maritime neighbor, in fact, our closest maritime neighbor, and a key economic partner for India and ASEAN. It is also our largest trading partner in ASEAN. We import large quantities of crude palm oil and also coal from Indonesia. In turn, we export a lot of agricultural products, including bovine meat, and there is potential for other agricultural products as well. Our bilateral trade has increased just within a decade 4 times. So today it's about $18 billion. Indian companies have made significant investments in Indonesia. And according to a study, the cumulative Indian investments in Indonesia is over $15 billion. And it creates about 250,000, so 250,000 jobs is created by Indian companies in Indonesia. The Indian investments are in the sectors of infrastructure, power, textiles, steel, automobiles, mining, banking, and consumer goods. India and Indonesia have robust bilateral mechanisms for cooperation. In just 1 year alone, since President Jokowi's last visit, that is the December 2016 visit, we've had high-level ministerial interactions at the level of our foreign ministers, defense ministers, commerce and industry ministers, energy ministers, as also the first security dialogue. In fact, this year particularly started on a very propitious note with the visit of our external affairs minister to Indonesia for the Joint Commission meeting, followed soon thereafter by the first security dialogue and the visit of our their national security advisors, very substantive meeting with our NSA. And of course, President Jokowi visited in January as well. Key areas of cooperation for the future really is in pharmaceutical sector, in space, in defense, in security, and infrastructure. I'll just give you a little, some details about the program element of our Prime Minister. He'll reach there on 30th of May. The main day of engagement is 31st. 30th. So he reached on 29th, and the main day of engagement is 30th. He'll begin by going to the Kalibata National Heroes Cemetery. Thereafter, he'll reach the President's Palace, where he'll be accorded a ceremonial welcome, a guard of honor, hold a tete-a-tete, and then followed by bilateral delegation-level talks. There are some agreements that are under discussion in the area of defense, space, and science and technology, which are still being negotiated. So we'll share details as we go along. Thereafter, our leaders will visit the National Museum and inaugurate a kite festival. What is special about the kite festival is a cooperation between Museum Layang Layang of Jakarta and the Kite Museum of Ahmedabad. And they will be depicting the common themes of Ramayana and Mahabharata. Yet again, another very strong cultural, civilizational linkage that we share with Indonesia, which will be showcased through this particular kite exhibition, which will be viewed by our leaders together. Our Prime Minister is also scheduled to address the Indian community and a CEO's forum. There are people of about 100,000 of Indian origin in Indonesia and about 7,000 NRIs as professionals working in different parts of this beautiful country. Indonesia, in multinationals and other companies as well. Moving on to Singapore, I already mentioned that Prime Minister had visited Singapore twice in 2015 when our relationship was upgraded to a strategic partnership. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has visited on an official visit to India in October 2016 when our both prime ministers held very substantive discussions. And again this year, for the ASEAN summit, the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong also co-chaired the India-ASEAN Commemorative Summit. I've already mentioned Singapore is our strategic partner and plays a vital role in advancing India's Act East policy and in deepening our relations with ASEAN. We function under 4 major pillars of our strategic partnership. One is security, the other is economic cooperation, The next is technology and innovation. And the last is cultural links and people-to-people contacts. Singapore is the second largest source of investment in India, accounting for 16% of total FDI in India between 2000 and 2017. Over 8,000 Indian companies are registered in Singapore, and our bilateral trade with Singapore is $15 billion, accounting for 20% of India's trade with the ASEAN region. Singapore companies have become major partners in areas like urban development and planning, smart cities, infrastructure development, including ports, aviation, industrial parks, and logistics. India's oldest uninterrupted bilateral naval exercise is held with Singapore. There are about 242 flights per week each way, connecting Singapore to 15 Indian cities. That just shows, and it has really just been a development of last decade or so. About 10% of Singapore's nationals, that is about 300,000, 60,000, are of Indian origin. The total resident Indian population is estimated to be about 800,000. Over 1.3 million Indians actually visit Singapore as tourists. So really they're the third largest tourist component to Singapore. Singapore has the highest concentration of IIT and IIM alumni. So that just shows the number of professionals it has attracted. I'll just again give you a bit about our Prime Minister's program there. He reaches on 31st. He'll begin his program by visiting an India-Singapore Enterprise and Innovation Exhibition, which will showcase innovations in frontier technologies, including artificial intelligence and fintech, and innovation for social impact. The exhibits will be both from Indian and Singapore companies. Our Prime Minister will then participate in a business and a community event where he will speak about India's economic engagement with ASEAN and also talk about the reforms and investment climate in India. Several business agreements are expected to be signed during that particular event. Thereafter, our Prime Minister will attend a CEO's roundtable of top 20 CEOs from Singapore and discuss business opportunities and investment opportunities in India. On June 1st is his official program, which will begin with a ceremonial welcome, a guard of honor, a call on the President of Singapore, Madam Halima Yaqub, delegation level talks, and then, of course, there'll be an official banquet that will be hosted in honor of our Prime Minister. It is expected that our discussions again are continuing, and we'll keep you updated. But we hope to sign some agreements in the field of defense, space, and skill development during this visit. Apart from this official component of the bilateral talks, our Prime Minister will also visit Nanyang Technological University. This university is ranked the top best technological university in Asia, and the 11th in ranking in the world. It is considered a leading center for research in artificial intelligence and also has world-class water research center and an energy research institute. Our Prime Minister will interact with the President and the board members of this university, and we hope that there will be some agreements signed with this university and some of the Indian institutions. Later that day in the evening, our Prime Minister will deliver that keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue. This would be the first time that an Indian Prime Minister has been invited to deliver the keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Leaders of several other countries have delivered keynote addresses earlier, but the first time for an Indian Prime Minister. This dialogue is a platform to articulate regional security issues. Our Prime Minister would convey, as expected, India's views on peace and security in the region and India's role in the region. The following day, that is on 2nd of June, our Prime Minister will unveil a plaque of Mahatma Gandhi at the Clifford Pier. This is the place where Mahatma Gandhiji's ashes were immersed in the sea on 27th of March, 1948. Our Prime Minister is also likely to visit some cultural sites which bring a close connect between India and Singapore. He will then visit the India Heritage Center, where he'll inaugurate a special exhibition on Indian symbols and scripts and handicrafts. And then before departure, our Prime Minister will visit the Changi Naval Base, where he will visit an Indian naval ship that is visiting and interact with officers and sailors of the Indian Navy and the Royal Singapore Navy. I'll stop here just to say that I'm happy to take questions, but that Prime Minister looks forward to his visit to these two very important countries with whom we have strategic partnerships. And he looks forward to continuing the substantive discussions that he's held with the leaders in January earlier this year. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now the floor is open to questions. Yes, please. Can you just hold on until the mic comes to you?
I'm Rekha Dixit from The Week magazine. You mentioned that there's an Indian naval ship there on a tour, on a visit, and the Prime Minister will be interacting. Could you name the ship, ma'am, please?
I don't have the details, I'm sorry. I'll get you the details. We'll share the details with you later.
Ranjit. I think the mic is not working. Can you switch it on, please? Yeah.
Can you elaborate on ongoing defense and security cooperation programs between India and Indonesia?
We will take one more question. Smita.
Smita Sharma from the Tribune. Just a related question, because the defense cooperation agreement with Indonesia has also expired. So is there any new, we are looking forward to the renewal of this cooperation. What is, a likely new element that we can look forward to? And if you could elaborate slightly more on really the significance of the Shangri-La dialogue, what are the broad topics that we are expecting the Prime Minister to address? Thank you.
As far as defense cooperation with Indonesia is concerned, I think our talks with them have intensified in recent years, and that is quite obvious by the fact that we had a defense ministers meeting and the NSA level talks. Because they are our maritime neighbor, certainly there is interest on maritime domain awareness and about cooperation in the maritime sector. So really, Navy to Navy cooperation is an important element. Discussions are underway. Yes, you're right that we are also talking in terms of renewal of the defense cooperation. But we'll be able to share more details after the agreement has been signed and renewed. Moving on to the Shangri-La dialogue, you know that the Shangri-La dialogue is now for the last decade or so become an important platform for track one. So important leaders from the world are invited, from the Asia-Pacific region have been invited. There have been other prime ministers, from the leaders from Australia, from Japan, from Korea and others who have articulated their views. Defense ministers meet there regularly. It certainly provides an opportunity for our Prime Minister to articulate his thoughts about India's policies on peace and security in the Indo-Pacific region. And that would be the focus of his keynote address. Certainly, it will give him an opportunity to share his philosophy of the Sagarmala and as part of this keynote address. But let's wait for the address to take place. But this would be the broad framework, I'd imagine.
Siddhant and then Kalol.
Ma'am, on connectivity, what will be the focus? Because Andaman Islands are near Aceh province, so are we planning some kind of connectivity projects there? Can you just elaborate on that? How much connectivity will focus with Indonesia and Singapore both?
Well, yeah, okay.
Connected question. The Indonesian Maritime Minister last week informed that we are in talks for gaining access to a port. So the question is, are you going to increase Indian investment in that port so that you can develop it? And because he's also offered submarine facilities for India. What do you have to say about those details?
So to begin with, first is the connectivity. I think connectivity is a very important component of our engagement, not just with Indonesia and Singapore, but with all of the ASEAN countries. And you would recall that in 2015, our Prime Minister had in fact offered lines of credit to the ASEAN countries for not just physical connectivity, but digital and people-to-people connectivity. So connectivity takes on a much bigger dimension. But of course, physical connectivity is a very important one, including connectivity by land, by air, and by sea. We are, in fact, in discussions with the ASEAN on all of these to have frameworks in position, which will facilitate greater connectivity of India with the ASEAN countries. You know that the northeast of India is an important land bridge to the ASEAN region, and then we have, of course, the maritime neighborhood. Specifically, Indonesia being the closest maritime neighbor from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to Sabang is really, how much would it be? About 90 nautical miles. So that's how close it is. And I'm told that on a clear day from the extreme edge, we could actually see the lights of Singapore and the eastern, the westernmost parts of Indonesian islands as well. There have been discussions about building infrastructure of talks, not just seaports, but also airports. You know, for example, Indian companies have actively, in fact, been there in Philippines, for example. Just recently, there has been some announcements about GMR participating in airport projects. And so there would be a lot of interest amongst Indian companies to participate in infrastructure, building infrastructure, ports, airports, etc. And that has been an ongoing discussion with Indonesia. And in the case of Singapore, given the fact that they themselves have a lot of strength in the infrastructure sector, and they have been in discussions with several entities within India. So these are ongoing discussions. If there are specific projects, those we would be announcing at the time of the visit. So maybe it's premature for me to share specifics at this time. Connectivity, and yeah, I've answered both.
Athar?
Good evening. This is regarding Indonesia. Recently, I think someone mentioned as well, the Minister for Maritime Cooperation for Indonesia had made some positive comments about maritime security and cooperation as well. Even though Indonesia is not officially part of the grouping Quad, is there any plan, or how should I put it delicately, is there a plan to re-stress or explore whether or not in principle, even though Indonesia is not part of that grouping, to get some sort of in-principle support, or is there a possibility of that likely to be explored during the visit?
You know, as I mentioned, Indonesia is a very close maritime neighbor of ours, and we are in discussions with Indonesia, of course bilaterally, but very strongly in the ASEAN context with all the 10 ASEAN countries. We've had, in fact, a trilateral dialogue at the official level of Indonesia, Australia, and India. And so, you know, and India and Indonesia are very strong members of the Indian Ocean Rim Association as well. So the IORA is yet another very important component where we have discussions with Indonesia. We will be very happy to further enhance our cooperation, collaboration, and coordination with Indonesia as far as you know, discussions, whether it's bilaterally or trilaterally or a larger context is concerned, given our strong strategic interests and our economic strength in the relationship.
Possibility is open. I would take that away from that. Thank you.
Manas?
Ma'am, both Singapore and Indonesia actually are very crucial for India's maritime security. We have enhancing our cooperation with both the countries. But ma'am, in fact, Singapore had last year expressed reservation over, in fact, formation of the Quad actually. And Indonesia has also learned to have some reservations about having a bloc, actually formation of a bloc like Quad among India, US, Australia, and Japan. So ma'am, will there be any discussions on, in fact, bridging the gaps, or in fact, to bring these two countries on the same platform and in fact, leave aside their differences and then allow India to play a greater role in a Quad format, ma'am?
You know, I think there are questions that are getting linked to the Quad format, which really should not be of concern, because as far as our discussions with Indonesia, Singapore, and other ASEAN countries is concerned, what we hear repeatedly from them is a deep sense of appreciation about India's position as far as our interactions with them bilaterally are concerned, or as far as ASEAN is concerned, because we've constantly maintained, even in the concept in the Indo-Pacific region, we have maintained that we give primacy and importance to ASEAN's unity and ASEAN's centrality in the regional security architecture. And that is something that has been deeply appreciated by all the ASEAN countries, and certainly by Indonesia and Singapore. And it is in that context that we will continue to engage with them, both in the multilateral context, in the bilateral context, and in any other context as well.
Yes, please.
Thomas from Malayalam Manorama. See, you mentioned the India's investment in Indonesia. What about Indonesian investments in India? And after the FTA with the ASEAN, has the trade deficit increased or decreased? And is it in favor of India?
With the ASEAN-India FTA? No, you're right. I think we have more Indian investments in Indonesia than the other way around. Indonesian investments in India are relatively modest, about $700 million. But certainly we could do better, and it is the fact that our Prime Minister is actually holding a business component as part of his official visit. The idea is, of course, to also attract and be enunciating and talking in detail about the kind of reforms that have taken place, how India is a better place for trade and investment. The idea is, in fact, to attract more Indonesian investments into India as well. And we hope that that record will, in fact, improve. As far as the India-ASEAN FTA in goods is concerned, yes, it has done well. It has certainly helped enhance bilateral trade. I don't have the breakup figures individually, but certainly I'd be happy to share those figures of what has been the trend vis-a-vis Indonesia. But our trade with them has certainly improved 4 times, from about $3 billion just a decade back to $15 billion speaks for itself.
We will take the last 2 questions, Akhilesh and Ranjit. Okay, last 3 questions.
Ma'am, has there been any improvement as far as the Quad itself is concerned? Because we had informal talks on Quad, but there has been no official, higher level talks on Quad. So has there been any improvement?
No, Akhilesh, this is not linked to the visit. I think Quad question has been answered by Secretary. I will not take any other question on Quad. Ranjit.
Since many heads of states would be attending Shangri-La dialogue, would Prime Minister would be interacting with them bilaterally?
Okay, any other question?
The last question. Again. Okay, you ask your question, then I'll decide.
I'm just a little confused. Are we saying that Indonesia might join in at some point?
You are saying?
No, I'm asking you, are you saying that? I'm a little confused. Not very sure what to...
That would be for Indonesia to respond, not India.
No, is there anything... Are you all going to ask them? Is India going to ask? Or is there any move at in that direction? That's all I'm just a little confused.
I'm not aware. Okay. And as far as the bilateral, any other meetings on the margins of the Shangri-La dialogue are concerned, his program is still evolving. There's still a week's time to go before the visit begins. And so certainly if it's an important bilateral meeting, you will be informed of it. But this is, it's still evolving. But Prime Minister has a very busy schedule in both cities. So,
has been answered. Thank you very much. This concludes this special briefing. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Manish, and thank you all for joining.